63 years old, sitting in a hospital waiting room in my nightgown with a cracked rib and 2 black eyes, when my son-in-law's carefully constructed lie finally started to fall apart. The ER doctor had just walked back in holding my chart, and the look on his face told me everything was about to change. But to understand how I ended up there, you need to go back to the beginning. You need to understand that I used to be a woman who laughed easily, who hosted Sunday dinners, who never once imagined that the man my daughter called her husband would spend 4 years trying to destroy her. My name is Lorraine. I'm 66 now, and I live in a quiet little house outside of Columbus, Ohio, with my 2 cats and a garden that finally looks the way I always wanted it to. But 2.5 years ago, my life looked nothing like this. 2.5 years ago, I was watching my daughter disappear, and I didn't even know it until almost too late. Before I go any further, if this story means something to you, if it reminds you of someone you love or something you've lived through, please hit that like button and subscribe, and leave me a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one. You have no idea how much it means to me to know I'm not just talking into the void, that real people are out there listening. Okay, let me take you back. My daughter's name is Noelle. She was 38 when all of this came to a head, but she'd been married to him for 6 years by then. His name was Vincent. And when she first brought him home to meet me at Thanksgiving, I want to be honest with you, I liked him. Lord help me, I liked the man. He was 42, worked in commercial real estate, had a firm handshake, and remembered to compliment my sweet potato casserole. He called me Miss Lorraine even after I told him he could call me by my first name. He seemed solid, dependable. My daughter had been through a rough stretch in her 30s. A broken engagement at 31, a layoff from her marketing job, a period where she was just kind of treading water. When Vincent came along, she lit up. I mean, genuinely lit up, the way she hadn't since she was in her 20s. He took her to Charleston for her birthday. He learned that she loved old black and white films and started a collection for her. He drove 45 minutes each way to her favorite bakery just to surprise her with those lemon bars she likes. I thought, finally, someone who sees what I've always seen in her. They got married at a small vineyard outside of Dayton, just 60 guests. Twinkle lights everywhere. The ceremony right at sunset. Noelle wore her grandmother's pearl earrings. She cried reading her vows, and so did I, standing in the second row with my camera shaking because I couldn't hold it steady. I thought it was one of the happiest days of my life. I had no idea that mask had already started to slip. She told me later that the first time he grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise was 3 weeks before that wedding. 3 weeks. She'd made an offhand comment to one of the bridesmaids about a groomsman being handsome. Just a throwaway remark, the kind of thing anyone says. And he'd waited until they were alone in the hotel hallway that night, and he'd gripped her arm and said, "Don't ever embarrass me like that again." She laughed it off, because what else do you do 3 weeks before your wedding, when the venue is booked and the dress is altered and your mother is flying in from Columbus? But that moment never left her. She told me later it was like a door opened, just a crack, and let in a cold wind. And no matter how many times she tried to push it shut, the cold just kept finding its way in. I noticed things over the first year of their marriage. Small things I dismissed. She stopped calling me every Sunday the way she used to. When I'd call her, there were pauses before she answered. That particular kind of pause where you can tell the person is checking to see if it's safe to talk. She started canceling on our monthly lunches. First it was a headache, then Vincent had made plans she'd forgotten about, then she just wasn't feeling well. I told myself she was busy. I told myself newlywed life takes adjustment. I told myself I was being one of those smothering mothers who can't let go. By the second year, the cancellations had turned into disappearances. Weeks would go by without a real conversation. When I'd finally reach her, she'd sound thin. I don't mean her voice exactly, though that too. I mean she sounded like a person who was carefully measuring out how much of herself she could give before it cost her something. I asked her once, directly. We were sitting in my kitchen. She'd come over alone while Vincent was at a conference, and I made her coffee and sat across from her at the table, and I just said, "Noelle, is everything okay at home?" She looked at me for a long moment, and then she smiled, that careful smile I'd started recognizing, and said, "Mom, I'm fine. You worry too much. I let it go. I shouldn't have, but I let it go." What I didn't know was what was happening inside that house. What I couldn't have imagined, because I had raised my daughter to be strong-willed and sharp and nobody's fool, was that by the time she'd been married 2 years, he had already isolated her from nearly everyone she loved. He picked fights before every family gathering, manufacturing reasons for her to stay home, until my sister stopped inviting them because, as she put it, Noelle never comes anyway. He'd made comments about her friends, subtle ones at first. Though I think Renata is kind of dramatic, or I'm not sure what you two even have in common anymore. Until she found herself calling them less and less. He'd taken over their finances after her second year of marriage, telling her it just made sense since he earned more, and she'd let him because it seemed logical at the time. But what that meant in practice was that she had no credit card of her own, no savings account he didn't know about, and an allowance for groceries and gas that she had to account for with receipts. I want to pause here because I know someone watching this is going to think, why didn't she just leave? She's a grown woman. She had a phone. She could have called someone. And I understand why that seems simple from the outside. I've asked myself that question 1,000 times in the years since, lying awake at night, going over it. What I've come to understand, through a lot of reading and a lot of therapy of my own, is that by the time the abuse becomes severe, the person has usually been so systematically stripped of their sense of self that leaving no longer feels like a real option. He'd spent years convincing her she was too sensitive, too needy, too difficult to love. He'd convinced her that if she told anyone what was happening, no one would believe her because he was charming and well-liked and had no visible reason to be cruel. He told her she'd lose the house, lose in court, end up with nothing. By the time she needed to leave most urgently, she'd been made to feel like she had nowhere to go. The physical violence had escalated over the 3rd year. She kept it hidden with long sleeves, with concealer, with excuses so practiced they came out smooth and automatic. She learned his patterns. Fridays were bad because he'd had a full work week and came home wound tight. When the Cincinnati Reds were losing, bad. When anything felt outside his control, very bad. She became an expert at reading the weather of his moods from the way he closed the car door, from the sound of his footsteps on the front porch. I still didn't know. That is the part I find hardest to say out loud. My daughter was being hurt inside her own home, 22 miles from my front door, and I didn't know. She was protecting me. She told me that later. She said, "Mom, you would have driven over there and confronted him, and he would have made it so much worse." And she was right. I would have. And she knew him well enough to know that any outside interference would have been paid for by her once the door closed. The night everything changed was a Tuesday in March, a little over 2 years ago. I remember the date because it was 3 days after my granddaughter's birthday. Wait, let me back up. Yes, there was a granddaughter. Noelle and Vincent had a little girl named Paige, who was 5 years old that March. She is the reason everything eventually came out. She is the reason my daughter is alive." That Tuesday evening, Noelle had picked Paige up from kindergarten. Vincent was supposed to be at a work dinner, but had come home early. She hadn't known he'd be there. When she walked in with Paige and the groceries, she set everything down on the kitchen counter and he came downstairs, and from the look on his face she knew immediately it was going to be a bad night. She didn't know why. She never knew why. He started in on her in the kitchen, his voice low, so Paige, who was in the next room watching cartoons, wouldn't hear. Noelle tried to keep her voice steady, tried to manage it, tried to de-escalate the way she'd learned to do. But he wasn't having it. He grabbed her by the back of the neck and shoved her face into the kitchen wall. Hard. She heard something, a crack, and the pain was immediate and total. Then he heard Paige start to cry from the other room, and it broke whatever spell he was in. He stepped back. He looked at Noelle, who had slid down against the cabinet and was sitting on the floor with her hand over her eye, and he said very calmly, "Get yourself together before she sees you like this." He went in to Paige. He read her a bedtime story, from what Noelle could hear. She sat on the kitchen floor until the pain had steadied to something she could move through. Then she cleaned herself up. She made excuses to Paige. She went to bed, but Paige had seen something through the doorway before her father pulled her away. She was 5 years old, and she didn't have the words for what she'd seen, but children carry things even when they can't say them. The next morning at kindergarten, Paige's teacher, a woman named Miss Adler, noticed that Paige was quiet in a way that was different from her usual quiet. During free draw time, Paige drew a picture. Miss Adler looked at the picture for a long time. Then she gently asked Paige to tell her about it. I don't know exactly what Paige said. I've never pushed her on it, and I never will. She was 5. But whatever she said and whatever was in that drawing was enough that by noon that day, Miss Adler had made a call to her school counselor, who had made a call to Child Protective Services, who had sent a caseworker to the school by 2 o'clock. I got a call from Noelle at 2:30. She was whispering, and the whisper itself terrified me more than any word she'd said in years. She said, "Mom, someone from CPS is at the school. They want to talk to me. They want to talk to both of us. You need to come." I don't remember the drive. I remember parking crookedly in the school parking lot and half running to the front entrance. I remember the look on the caseworker's face when she saw me come through the door. A measured, experienced look. The kind of face that has seen this before and is not surprised by it. I remember being taken into a small room and sitting across from my daughter. What happened in that room was the first time in 6 years that Noelle told anyone the truth. She started slowly. She stopped and restarted. She apologized twice, which broke my heart both times, as if she needed to apologize for telling me she'd been hurt. The caseworker, whose name was Patricia, was patient and quiet, and asked only the questions that needed to be asked. And as Noelle talked, I sat across from her, and I looked at the daughter I had raised, and I saw all the moments that suddenly made sense. Every canceled lunch. Every canceled lunch. Every careful smile. Every pause before she answered the phone. At some point, I reached across the table and took her hand, and I didn't let go for the rest of that conversation. She had bruising along her left cheekbone and near her eye from the night before. She'd used concealer, but it wasn't covering it anymore. The caseworker photographed it. She asked Noelle if she needed medical attention, and Noelle said her cheekbone felt wrong, not like a bruise, and Patricia said they needed to go to the hospital. I drove. Noelle sat in the passenger seat, and I kept looking over at her, and she kept staring straight out the windshield, very still, the way you get when you're holding yourself together by sheer will. When we got to the ER at Riverside Methodist, they took Noelle back to a bay and started examining her. Vincent didn't know where we were. He thought Noelle was picking up Paige from school. He didn't know about the caseworker, didn't know about any of it yet, and I was terrified that he would figure it out and show up. I told the intake nurse that her husband was potentially dangerous and that we hadn't told him we were here. The nurse made a note of it and quietly told security. The ER doctor came in after the x-rays. He was a younger man, maybe mid-30s. With reading glasses, he kept pushing up with one finger. He sat down in the chair beside Noelle's bed rather than standing over her, which I noticed. He said her cheekbone had a fracture. A small one, but a fracture. And then he said the thing that changed the entire direction of what happened next. He said, "This injury is consistent with blunt force trauma, not a fall or an accident, and I can see from this examination that it isn't isolated." He paused. "I'm required to ask you directly. Did someone do this to you?" Noelle looked at me. I squeezed her hand. She looked back at the doctor and she said very quietly, "Yes." And that was it. That was the word. One word that unlocked 6 years of silence. The doctor explained that he was obligated by Ohio law to report suspected domestic violence to the hospital social worker. He was not asking her permission. He was informing her respectfully of what was going to happen next. A social worker came within 15 minutes. Then, because the CPS case had already been opened that afternoon, there was coordination I didn't fully understand in real time, but that later made sense. The pieces were already moving. Noelle had told the truth to the caseworker. The doctor had confirmed the injury was not accidental. And suddenly, there were multiple agencies who had documentation. I stepped out into the hallway at one point, and I stood there by the water fountain, and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since Noelle's father died. Not pretty crying, the ugly kind, hands over my mouth, shoulders shaking. A nurse I didn't know touched my arm and asked if I was all right, and I said no, not really, but I'm going to be. She nodded like she'd heard that before, too. Here is the part I am still angry about when I let myself think about it too long. Vincent had been contacted by then. He didn't know exactly what we'd told anyone, but he knew something had happened at the school with Paige, and he came to the hospital. He walked in looking like a concerned husband. He had brought flowers, actual flowers, a small bouquet from the gas station by the look of them, and he held them and walked toward Noelle's room with this expression on his face that I can only describe as practiced grief. He did not expect to find me there. When he saw me standing in the doorway of Noelle's room, something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly, more like recalculation. He said, "Lorraine, thank God. Is she all right? I came as soon as I heard." I looked at him for a long time. 6 years of Sunday dinners and holiday photos and watching my daughter get smaller and smaller. 6 years of telling myself I was overreacting. 6 years of that firm handshake. I said, "You need to leave." He said, "She's my wife." "I have every right." I said it again. Louder that time. The security guard was already coming down the hall. The social worker had flagged him when she heard his name. He was escorted out of the ER. He stood on the sidewalk outside the sliding doors for a long time, from what the nurse told me later. Eventually, he left. The detective assigned to the case came to the hospital that evening. She was a woman in her 50s named Detective Calloway, compact and unhurried. The kind of person who makes you feel like she has all the time in the world, even when she doesn't. She took Noelle's statement carefully, stopping only to make sure Noelle was all right to continue. She photographed the injuries. She asked about other incidents, and Noelle told her all of it, the whole geography of 6 years. Later, Detective Calloway told us that the CPS documentation from that afternoon, combined with the ER records and Noelle's statement, gave them enough to arrest Vincent that night. They went to the house. He had, apparently, been in the process of packing a bag. The detective mentioned this to me with a flat, unsurprised expression, but told me it wasn't the first time she'd seen that either. He was charged with felony domestic violence, aggravated assault causing serious physical harm, and one count related to the presence of Paige during an act of domestic violence, which under Ohio law carries additional weight. His bail was set at a number he could not post quickly, which meant he sat in the Franklin County Jail while the case was built around him. Noelle and Paige came to stay with me. I made up the guest room for Noelle and moved the twin bed from storage into the small room next to mine for Paige, the one I'd always called the craft room. I put a nightlight in the shape of a star in the outlet by the door because Paige was afraid of the dark now, more than she'd been before. I didn't ask why. I just put in the nightlight. The weeks that followed were not simple. I want to be honest about that, because I think sometimes these stories jump too quickly to the relief, and the relief was real, but so was everything else. Noelle had nightmares. She'd come downstairs at 2 a.m, and I'd already be up, because I'd heard her, and we'd sit at the kitchen table and drink chamomile tea and not always talk. Sometimes we'd just sit. I'd read once that being present doesn't always mean filling the silence, and I tried to remember that. I'm not always good at not talking. Paige went to therapy twice a week through a children's program connected to the Domestic Violence Center. Her therapist had this little sandbox she'd let Paige arrange figures in, and apparently Paige took to it immediately. The therapist told us that Paige was processing and that children that age are more resilient than we think when they have consistent safety. I held on to that phrase like a rope. Consistent safety. That's what we could give her. That's what we focused on. The divorce was filed within the first month, while Vincent was still in jail. He hired a lawyer, of course, and the lawyer tried to paint Noelle as unstable, as someone who had fabricated the injury, as a woman who was using the legal system vindictively to win a custody battle. I sat in on some of those early proceedings, and I want to tell you, listening to a man in an expensive suit suggest that my daughter had somehow broken her own cheekbone was one of the more surreal experiences of my life. The divorce was finalized before the criminal trial on grounds of domestic violence, with full physical custody of Paige granted to Noelle. He received supervised visitation rights pending the outcome of the criminal case, which he never exercised, not once. The criminal trial was 8 months after his arrest. I went every day I was permitted to be there. I watched my daughter walk into that courtroom on the first day of testimony, and I thought, I have never in my life been more proud of any human being. She was on the witness stand for almost a full day. His defense attorney tried every tactic I'd read about and a few I hadn't. He asked why she'd stayed. She answered. He suggested she was motivated by custody of Paige. She answered. He brought up a brief period when she'd been in therapy years before Vincent and tried to use it to characterize her as emotionally unstable. The prosecutor objected. The judge sustained it. His attorney tried to make her sound dramatic, overwrought, unreliable. She sat there in that chair and answered every question in a steady voice that I know cost her more than anyone in that courtroom could see. The ER doctor testified about the fracture and the pattern of injury. Miss Adler, Paige's kindergarten teacher, testified about the drawing and what Paige had said. Detective Calloway testified about the arrest and the packed bag. The CPS caseworker testified about the documentation from that Tuesday afternoon. It was not one person's word against another's. It was a structure built carefully from multiple directions, and it held. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours, guilty on all counts. I was holding Noelle's hand when the verdict was read, the same way I'd held it in that small room at the school, the same way I'd held it in the hospital. She didn't make a sound. She just closed her eyes for a moment, and I saw her exhale. Really exhale, the way you do when you've been holding your breath for a very long time. At sentencing, Noelle read a victim impact statement. I had read it the night before, sitting at my kitchen table while she sat across from me, and I had made it exactly halfway through before I had to put it down and press my hands flat on the table and just breathe for a minute. She had written it herself. She didn't want help with it. She said it was the one thing in this entire process that was entirely hers, and she was right to want it that way. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Under Ohio sentencing guidelines for his charges, with the aggravating factor of the child being present during domestic violence, 7 years was not the ceiling, but it was substantial. He would be required to complete a batterer intervention program while incarcerated. There would be a permanent protective order keeping him from Noelle and Paige. When he was eventually released, he would be subject to conditions that would follow him for the rest of his life. When they led him out of the courtroom, he looked at Noelle, just for a second, and whatever he was looking for in her face, whatever control or fear or power he expected to still find there, it wasn't there anymore. She looked right back at him, and there was nothing in her expression that gave him anything. No fear, no grief, no satisfaction even. Just a woman who was done. That was 2.5 years ago. Noelle and Paige are still living with me, though we've been talking about finding them their own place in the same neighborhood. Close enough that Paige can ride her bike to my house on Saturdays, which she does every weekend now, and has started calling Grammy Lorraine's Pancake Day. Noelle went back to work about a year ago. She took a position with a nonprofit that does communications work. A smaller salary than her old marketing jobs, but work she believes in, and she lights up talking about it in a way I recognize. The way she used to light up before. She has a therapist she sees every other week and describes her as the most useful person she's ever paid money to, which made me laugh the first time she said it. Paige is 7 now. She's in 2nd grade. She loves horses and chapter books and correcting me when I mispronounce things, which, according to her, is often. She still has hard days. She still sometimes comes to find me in the night, but the nightmares are fewer. The therapist says she's doing remarkably well. I believe her, but I also keep the nightlight plugged in. I figure there's no harm in that. I am not the same person I was before any of this. I think about all the Sundays I let pass without pushing harder. I think about all the canceled lunches I accepted at face value. I think about that Thanksgiving when I liked his firm handshake and thought finally, if I could go back, I would ask different questions. I would pay different attention. But I also know that Noelle was protecting me, and I have to find a way to hold both things. The guilt of not knowing and the understanding that she made the choices she made out of love, as complicated and painful as those choices were. What I know now, what I will tell anyone who will listen, is this. If someone you love starts to disappear, don't let politeness stop you from asking the hard question directly. Not, is everything okay, in the soft way that invites a soft answer. The direct question, the one that leaves a door open wide enough for the truth to walk through. And if they're not ready to tell you the truth, don't close the door. Just leave it open. Keep showing up. Keep putting in the nightlight. Because Paige saw something through a doorway and carried it to school in a drawing. And a teacher looked at that drawing and did not look away, and a doctor asked a direct question and waited for a real answer. And those moments, stacked on top of each other, changed everything. My daughter is alive because of a 5-year-old's drawing, a teacher who paid attention, and a doctor who sat down instead of standing over her. Small choices. Small acts of courage from people who could have easily looked the other way. Don't look the other way. If you're in a situation like the one I've described, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline. The number is 1-800-799-7233. You can also text START to 88788. It's free, it's confidential, and it's available around the clock. If you're not ready to call, that's all right. Save the number, put it somewhere he won't find it, and know that there are people on the other end of that line who will believe you without you having to prove a single thing. And if you're someone like me, standing on the outside watching someone you love get smaller, trust that instinct. Trust the pause before she answers. Trust the canceled lunches. Trust the careful smile. You know your person. You know when something is wrong. Thank you for sitting with me through this story. It is not an easy one to tell, but I believe with everything in me that it is worth telling. If it reaches one person in the right moment, it will have been worth every hard word. Please share it if you think it might help someone you know. And leave me a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me your story if you want to. I'll be reading. I keep thinking about Paige's drawing. A 5-year-old with a box of crayons and no words for what she'd seen, so she did the only thing she knew how to do. She drew it, and a teacher looked at that piece of paper and chose not to explain it away. That choice, that one small, decent choice, is the thread that unraveled everything. I spent a lot of time since then thinking about what it actually means to do the right thing, not in some grand, sweeping way, in the ordinary Tuesday afternoon way. Miss Adler didn't save my daughter by doing something heroic. She saved her by being honest about what she was looking at, by asking a question she didn't have to ask, by refusing to convince herself it was nothing. That kind of moral clarity, the kind that costs you a little something in the moment, because it would be so much easier to look away, that is what I think goodness actually looks like in practice. Not a virtue you announce, a choice you make quietly when it matters. And Noelle, my daughter, who I raised to be sharp and capable and nobody's fool. It took me a long time to stop blaming myself for not knowing, and even longer to stop wondering why she didn't tell me sooner. What I've come to understand is that surviving what she survived required a particular kind of intelligence, not the kind you learn in school, but the kind that keeps you alive in a dangerous situation. She read his moods from the sound of a car door. She calibrated her words in real time to avoid harm. She protected her daughter and her mother simultaneously for years, while also just trying to get through each day. That is not weakness. That is a form of clear-eyed, exhausting intelligence that most people will never be asked to demonstrate. When she finally sat across from that caseworker and told the truth, that was intelligence of a different kind, knowing that the moment had finally come, trusting it. What I am most in awe of, even now, is what it took for her to walk into that courtroom. I watched her on the witness stand for hours. His attorney did everything he could to rattle her, to make her feel small, to plant doubt in the jury's mind about her own memory and her own worth. And she sat there with her hands folded in her lap, and she answered every single question. That steadiness under that kind of pressure, after 6 years of being told she was nothing, that her word meant nothing, that no one would believe her. I don't have a word large enough for what that took. Courage feels too small. It was something more like will, the refusal to be erased one more time. I think about the ripple of it. Vincent made choices every day for years that he believed had no consequences. He was wrong. Every act of cruelty he committed was documented somewhere, in a bruise, in a hospital record, in a child's memory, in a drawing made with kindergarten crayons. Cause and effect doesn't always move quickly, but it moves. It found him eventually, in a courtroom, in a verdict, in a sentence read aloud while he sat in an orange jumpsuit, and my daughter exhaled for the first time in years. I am 66 years old, and I am still learning what it means to pay attention to the people I love. Not politely, really pay attention. Noelle is here. Paige is here. The nightlight is still in the outlet by the craft room door. Some mornings that is enough to make me feel like the world is, in spite of everything, worth the trouble.